It's not only a pleasure, but it's a privilege to be here with you this evening in this Hawaii-like weather for those of us in Chicago. When I left, it was way below zero, and my pipes burst. I've been dealing with frozen pipes all day, and thank God for the plumber. Give the plumber something. So he hooked up the flood in my basement, and now I have a brand new basement when I come back. But it is really, I've been so touched and so amazed by all I've seen and heard here. Everything is relative, and we maybe go into more of that in the Q&A session. But again, also, I want to thank my brother, Dr. Clark, for inviting me and all those who were behind the scenes. Martin Luther King said there might be a plane flying high, but there was always a ground crew that put that plane in the air. So we thank God for the ground crew. I'm going to talk about wealth and faith in Black American experiences. Wealth and faith in Black American experiences. There's a story about a man who was hungry, and so one church gave him fish every week. This was good because it kept him from bad health and made him stronger. And then another church decided the best assistance was to give him a fishing pole so he could fish on his own and provide for his wife and children. This, too, was a big improvement. And now his family had a steady, healthy diet, and the man began to take even more responsibility for himself and his family. His sense of his own individual power, family accountability, and future potential grew more and more. And then a third church came along and worked with the man to purchase the global company that made fishing poles. Now, with ownership of his own wealth, the man's view expanded into the international arena of trade and investments, and his plans and perspectives focused on how to transfer material wealth to his children, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. He became more aware of how everything he did each day now had a deep positive or negative impact for several future generations of his offspring. With his family and future legacy secured, he began to think about how to help other married couples with their children. Because the church had helped him gain material wealth, he worked with other couples to own their own companies. As a result, families began to focus more on their children and their future. At the same time, as couples owned more and more wealth, they also began to hire more and more people. Yeah. The workers likewise had aspirations of someday supporting their children by owning businesses and in turn providing employment for others in the community. Ownership of a variety of wealth provided income to improve the neighborhood schools, academic curricular activities, and training in musical instruments. Scholarships were established to ensure that each child spent 1 year studying abroad during their elementary, junior high, and high school years. The parents focused on making sure that each child was prepared to become global citizens and own global companies and care for those on their local neighborhood block and for those in other countries. In fact, by following this one model among many of a church helping one married couple own an international firm, another possible pattern emerged for what it means to be a healthy family in the midst of many families. That one couple became more stable, and the homes next door developed in the same way. One block, then one neighborhood, one community, one city, one state, one region, one country, and then all the countries of the world got involved in prioritizing ownership of touchable goods and services that gave back monetary rewards to each family as a basis to prepare their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Indeed, in this one model, among other possible alternatives, the family duties became more and more clear. The duty of the parents was to take care of each and every day their children and to turn daily attention to the material, intellectual, emotional, and most foundationally spiritual necessities of their children. And the duty of the children became listening to the wise advice of their parents who were preparing the children for a healthy future as global business people with material resources anchored in a spirituality in order to continue their family legacy and help others both locally and internationally. And the duty of the grandfather and the grandmother was to spend every day with their grandsons and granddaughters in order to teach the young the years of wisdom and future dreams of their grandparents. In this one possible path, among others, Men's daily conversations began to focus more and more on matters of material wealth and the management of wealth and how to transfer ownership of companies to their own children. Children at home began to hear their fathers talk more and more about the three major aspects of financial decisions: how to invest, how to finance the investment, and how to pay off the returns on investment. How do parents who own wealth calculate the present value and future value of an asset? What is the capital price and asset model, cash flow assets, terminal evaluation, pro forma income statement, pro forma balance sheet? And what is their relationship to the net present value when a person is considering purchasing a company or not? How do parents understand the discounted interest rate in order to leverage the best economic outcome for their children? And at home, children began to hear conversations around the dinner table about the relationships among corporate finance, microeconomics, management accounting, financial accounting, leadership development, startups and disruptive innovation, statistics, mergers and acquisitions, emerging markets, hedge funds, crisis management, the art of negotiation, and social entrepreneurship. At the dinner table, when father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, and sons and daughters were eating together, the children began to listen closely to conversations about weighted average cost of capital, sourcing deals, restructuring deals, sourcing and exiting deals after 5 years, operations, procurement, sales, standard deviation, capital asset pricing, how to short an investment, the London Metal Exchange, investment portfolios, balance with stocks, bonds, currency, commercial real estate, oil and gas, blockchains, the internet, AI, ML, the fourth industrial revolution, and BRICS. With these daily role models from their fathers, grandfathers, mothers, and grandfathers, children began to imitate the parents. As a result, they began to use some of their own money they'd gotten from doing house chores and holiday events to invest in the stock market. Actually, some of the sons started an investment club among children on the same block. And some of the girls started little businesses like cutting neighbors' grass and home delivery shopping for the elders. And though these were attempts at businesses on the part of elementary and high school youth, the children's daily energies were focused on becoming future business leaders on their neighborhood block and in the world. Perhaps one of the ambitious visions was the dream of 3 children on the block who had a vision of setting up an international company that would be a global oasis. And this global oasis would help people in need, funnel resources for the poor, the oppressed, and the least of us, both domestically and throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Just think, among the many paths of one church fed fish to a hungry man, another church gave him a fishing pole, and a third helped him own an international business. And the world of the fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers began to change. And the children began dreaming of owning earth, air, and water. And students and professors started to study what these churches were doing. We want to talk about wealth this evening. Now, the traditional way people talk about wealth is in the following manner. Add up your total personal assets, such as cash, retirement accounts, your home, and then subtract the total of your liabilities, such as credit card debt, student loans, and mortgage. Now, another way to understand wealth is to compare it to income. Income is when someone else gives you a check. If a person works for someone else, then that person is dependent on that employer to give them income in the form of cash or a check. In contrast, wealth is when you own something that is not dependent on someone else giving you an income. For example, there's the story about, and it's a black church and Baptists, we make up all kinds of things. But there's a story that there were 2 men working in the post office. Say, I don't know what they make, $40,000 a year. And one was John D. Rockefeller, the old man, the 1890s oil baron. And the other was a working class black guy from the neighborhood. So they both were laid off during a recession. So we can imagine that for the unemployed brother who was laid off, he had to scramble and apply, stand in line for unemployment benefits. Rockefeller sat back and said, well, let me decide which of my islands I own I will visit now. That is the difference between income and wealth. Right. Income and wealth. Another example of trying to explain the difference between income and wealth is that wealthy people go to sleep at night and they wake up the next morning and in their bank account, they discover an extra $100,000. Those of us, majority of us, we wake up in the morning and we see that there's an automatic payment of a bill. Okay? That is the difference between wealth and income. So if anybody here waking up and then tomorrow morning you get $100,000, hook a brother up. Okay, let me know about it. I'll pray with you and for you. Another way to look at this question of income and wealth is from an article I read, and it loosely was titled 15 Lessons the Wealthy Persons Teach Their Children. So let me share them with you. I'll be in the condensed form. Lesson number 1. This is what the wealthy teach their children. Lesson number 1. Understand how money works. Wealthy parents talk to their very young children about how money works. Why am I being paid this much money by my employer? What factors determine my salary or my revenue? How do taxes work? What needs to happen to improve my finances? What are assets and what are liabilities? How do I own wealth and get money to possess more wealth? The wealthy begin this conversation with their children when their children are very, very young. Lesson number 2. Wealthy parents teach their children the difference between an asset and a liability. And this might be the key to the whole thing. An asset makes money. A liability costs money. For example, both cars that we drive and the houses that we live in are liabilities. They do not create any income or revenue for us. On the contrary, they demand money from us. In contrast, the wealthy focus all of their time on buying assets that bring money to their families. For instance, they might buy apartments or office buildings so they can have extra money coming to them every month. Or they might buy a business and get regular profit. And here's a very important point. The wealthy use the money they get from their assets to pay for the luxury homes and cars and boats and planes. They don't use their income. They use profits from their assets. Lesson number 3. The wealthy teach their children not to expect anyone to take care of them. Instead, they have to do as much as possible with whatever resources they have access to. Lesson number 4. The wealthy teach their children how to socialize and connect with other people. They introduce their children to other children, even as babies and toddlers. Socialize them into a network at a very young age. For example, and this is not that we're all in this wealthy class, but there's a brother who went to Milton Academy. I don't know if he's here, but there used to be in boarding schools in the United States that when people were, they were registered. And I was like, what do you mean register? So when they were born in the hospital, their parents registered which boarding school they would go to. So I'm not saying that's what we are, but we're trying to learn how do these people become who they are. Lesson number 5. The wealthy tell their children to stop expecting immediate results and avoid magical thinking. Don't have a lifestyle of immediate gratification. Don't live your life in a microwave oven that cooks dinner in 3 minutes. Because true wealth and true happiness do not exist in this world, or I got to have it now and everything in my life must give me immediate results. The wealthy teach their children to have a long perspective on life. They teach them to make plans for 5 to 10 and 20 years. And they teach them to think about their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, the legacy of the family. Lesson number 6. Wealthy parents teach their children how to create daily habits that in the long run will give them advantages in life. Make reading a habit. Make exercise a habit. And they teach their children the importance of using discipline to form healthy habits. In fact, daily habits are based on personal discipline. Keep focused, keep practicing in the good times and bad. Lesson number 7. Wealthy parents teach their children that money is a tool and money is also a very good thing. The danger is how people use money, not money itself. This actually reminds us of 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, where it says, the love of money is the root of all evil. This Bible teaching tells us not money, but the love of money, the coveting of money is the root of all evil. Lesson number 8, the wealthy parents teach their children to focus on increasing income instead of lowering expenses. Focusing more on increasing income can help people to be more creative and better at surviving, cutting corners, and figuring things out. Lesson number 9, wealthy parents teach their children that knowledge is more valuable than money in the long run. Learn as much as you can and make learning a lifelong habit. Lesson number 10, wealthy parents teach their children to not work for money. Have money work for them. Set aside some money and figure out how this money can help create more money for one's family, one's community, one's faith, extended family. Lesson number 11, wealthy parents teach their children that solving problems for humanity puts you on the path to a better financial life. Solve the problems of humanity, increase financial life. What are some problems that people have or that you know of? And how can you solve problems for humanity? Lesson number 12, wealthy parents teach their children to not waste time on things that do not correlate to the real world. Learn things that help with the real world, and that will be in your future legacy. Lesson number 13, wealthy parents teach their children how to use good debt and avoid bad debt. Bad debt is when you take out loans to buy a house. When I take out loans to buy a house, a car, or a new phone. Good debt is when a person borrows money that will help them invest in something for their family, their church, their community, and the larger humanity. Lesson number 14, wealthy parents teach their children that 80% of the results come from 20% of the effort. Work smart with focus and discipline can bring about good results for the common good. Lesson number 15, wealthy parents teach their children having money doesn't make you a better person. It just helps to solve some of the problems. So remember humility when your life improves, and closely connected to humility is having respect for others. And finally, money can pay for the comforts of the body, but it cannot pay for the comforts of the mind, the soul, and the spirit. And actually in this essay, there's a number 16 lesson that says, wealthy parents raise their children's expectations. They teach them that they can have a better life than their parents, and don't settle for mediocrity, strive for excellence. We're talking about wealth, and Black wealth in particular. And on this question of Black wealth, in reality, the majority of African Americans today are moving away from wealth. Instead of moving forward, we are moving backwards. Yes. Let's look at the numbers. Between 1983 and 2013, the median Black American household wealth declined from $6,800 to $1,700. That is a decline of 75%. And between now and 2020, experts predict that Black households will lose an additional 18% of wealth. And if this downward direction continues, by 2053, the median Black household wealth will be zero. Even more closely in time, we can raise the question, what impact did the recent Great Recession, the housing market crisis have on Black American wealth? Black American wealth, African American wealth in that period dropped from $16,600 in 2010 to $11,000 in 2013, a 33.7% drop in 3 years. This question of how do Black Americans think about wealth and relate to wealth is not really that new. The idea that African Americans are concerned about the material well-beings of their families and their children goes back over a century and a half ago. Specifically, after the end of the War of 1865, Civil War, the recently freed Blacks had three things on the top of their agenda. Now it's free women and free men. One, they wanted to travel the South to reconnect with families who had been sold in slavery. Two was education for themselves, if not themselves, their children. And three was to buy as much land as possible. In order to take care of family members, in order to provide education for their children, recently freed fathers and mothers knew that without wealth, not much else was possible. And that is why we are amazed at how many acres of land recently freed Blacks accumulated 10 to 20 years out of slavery. And not only do we see this issue coming up during the slavery period, but similar concerns can be found in some of the demands of the more recent 1950s and 1960s civil rights movement. We're talking about the legacy of Black wealth. We can see that some of the demands were all about wealth and the material well-being of Black families. We know about the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott that was started by Rosa Parks, Christian woman, and then led by the Black preachers, Dr. Martin Luther King, and the heroic martyrs who sacrificed their life. For instance, that 1955 Montgomery bus boycott included the demand for the hiring of black bus drivers in the Negro neighborhoods. And the boycott included a demand of wealth and income. So a lot of us don't realize that those were parts of the movement at the very beginning. The 1963 March on Washington demanded jobs or income. The official march slogan was jobs and freedom. To that point, though most of us remember the I Have a Dream theme of Dr. King's speech at that glorious march, actually the more powerful theme, in my opinion, was when he said, Negroes are here to ask the U.S. federal government to cash a check to provide funds for Negro communities. Listen to the whole speech from beginning to end. And King's second march on Washington, the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, he was assassinated, so he never made it to it. It asserted that American poor and working class people would not leave Washington, D.C. until the federal government passed meaningful legislation that lifted the load of poverty from the country's most economically vulnerable. And King stated about the central core message of this new March on Washington. He says, we called our demonstration a campaign for jobs and income. This is King. Because we felt that the economic question was the most crucial that black people and poor people generally were confronting. He goes on to say there was a literal depression in the Negro community. When you have mass unemployment in the Negro community, it's called a social problem. When you have mass unemployment in the white community, it's called a depression, close quote. So in addition to the Poor People's Campaign, King's last project in the spring of 1968 was supporting black working class garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, who wanted higher wages and better material working conditions. Moreover, when we turn to the youth wing of the civil rights movement that eventually turned into the Black Power movement, we see Stokely Carmichael, who was at the head of that Black Power movement. He was an organizer in the Delta in Mississippi, and we have to remember that the initial understanding of Black Power was that poor peasants and working class black folk in rural South should two things. They should own the land that they work on, and they should occupy all the public offices where black people were the majority. That was the beginning of Black Power. Of course, as us academics took over, we started talking about all kinds of other things, right? And we talk about that legacy of black folk and wealth. The Nation of Islam, founded by Elijah Muhammad and led by Malcolm X, created businesses and jobs for black men and women so they could take care of their children. At one point, the nation did international trade with Japan. Beginning in October 1966, up the road here in Oakland, California, the Black Panther Party, when it started, provided free material goods and services for urban inner city families, such as free medical checkups, education, free food, free clothing, and free scholarships. The Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which was the 1970s black movement and auto workers in Detroit, they fought for better wages and working conditions in order to help their families and their communities. The 1970s Boston black parents' efforts to improve their education, first they demanded money and material resources to help the black community, and then some other more official black leaders came in and turned it into forced busing. Initially, and it was the women. They said, our demands for you, look, okay, if you don't want us to go to South Boston, just give us the money and the material resources and we will educate our own. But it wasn't politically correct till some of the more official black leaders, in their own right, said, no, we need to be forced bused into South Boston. The 1970s African Liberation Support Committee raised funds, provided clothing, and boycotted tangible U.S. companies doing business with European and apartheid governments occupying Africa. Pan-African groups attempted to set up real, ongoing, accountable Black and African studies programs and departments on schools' campuses. The late 1960s and early 1970s projects included increasing Black faculty, increasing Black student enrollment, and stretching forth one's hands to Africa and other third world countries at that time. And do we really have to touch on the legacy of Black churches? We know Black churches have given money and jobs and food and housing and legal aid and medical aid, offered classes, educational scholarships, psychological and marital counseling, and produced a host of other material benefits to its members and other members. And of course, for Black churches, the question of taking care of the material needs of the community is seen as part of a vocation, a calling from Jesus Christ. In fact, what is I'm glad you asked that question. What is the content of that vocation? What are we called to think, believe, and preach and do? What is the faith in which God has called us to have faith? What is the nature of this faith? What does regeneration and renewal of Black Americans in the church, and in fact, all America, have to do with this question of the Black community, its legacy, and faith? And at least as a Baptist, and I think all people of faith, we have to start, first of all, with the primary source. We have to go to the Bible. To explore this answer, we turn to the Jesus stories in the Bible. We talked a little bit about this earlier today with the students, but in my read of the sacred text, there are three major stories that emerge that link wealth, material well-being with spiritual foundation. The first is the plumb line story in the so-called Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures. And if we look at that, it can be read in different ways, either your exegesis or your eisegesis, but we prefer, hopefully this is exegesis. We see a God, Yahweh, who steps out on compassion and love and recognizes and hears the pain and misery of the poor people in Egypt. Of course, we know Exodus 3, chapter 7 through 8. And there he says, the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now we have to remember that this is a powerful spiritual passage in the history of the church and our faith. But we also have to remember that this passage is talking about a God of compassion and love who liberates materially enslaved human bodies.
That's right.
These were slaves.
That's right.
These are real people who were slaves. I was at the tail end of segregation in the South. And if anybody grew up in that period, you know what pain, even though I was protected, I was the youngest child, but my older siblings and fathers and grandfathers, my great-grandfathers would tell stories about this is what this is passage talking about. Those people, the people who were enslaved, the people who were beat, people who were suffering, the people whose labor was given freely. See Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, where he talks about how the U.S. Capitol was built by free Black labor.
Yes, that's correct.
Then we also move from the stories in the Old Testament to two other important biblical passages. We talked about today in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 and following, where God announces God's reasons for coming on earth through Jesus Christ, and where it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. This is the announcement. This is the State of the Union message to the cosmos of why God the Father, the God, the parent has come. That tells about God's vocation. And then we move to the third part of the Bible is around Matthew 25, verses 31 and following. You know that? You know, not many, this is a very progressive and theologically educated crowd, but in many Black churches and churches throughout America, people just see it as a metaphor of the sheep and the goat. But it is, to my reading, the only clear passage where Jesus says this is the criteria for Christians to get to heaven. And the criteria to get to heaven is what? It's linked to the material reality. You know, when did we see you do that? Well, to the least of these. Did you feed me when I was hungry? When Richmond, we say hungry. But I don't got a PhD in Chicago, you hungry. When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give water? When I was in prison, did you come visit me? So it makes sense that this vocation that God sees in God's self through Jesus Christ, announced in Luke 4, chapter 4, verses 16 and following, is the same criteria that we need to fulfill in order to get to heaven. So this is why we're saying the issue of Black people, wealth, and our faith is primarily based, first of all, on the Bible. It arises from below of the presence of the Spirit amongst our people. And again, and we look at the tradition and legacy of Black folk faith, particularly Black church, we return to a second important source, which is Martin Luther King Jr. I mentioned that we remembered his beautiful I Have a Dream speech. But again, the core of that speech is what is this. He says, August 28th, 1963 in D.C., I have a March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech. Dr. King says, quote, In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was the promise that all men and women, black men as well as white men and women, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is Dr. King, not Dr. Hopkins. He goes on to say, it is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come this day to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon the demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Read the whole speech.
That's right.
We could go on, but we only have a few minutes to finish this up, and I won't do my Baptist black as I come to my conclusion in 40 minutes. You hear me in another location, we could do that. But now we want to continue with the matter at hand. We also know that Dr. King, we first talked about the most important source of the issue of black faith church is the Bible. And now we're talking about other examples, Dr. King in particular, since not only is this Dr. King's month, but if it wasn't, he was one of the greatest human beings the world has ever given birth to. 1963 March. He also gave a similar theme in the December 1955 boycott in Montgomery. And then the other third most famous speech of Dr. King was April 4th, 1967, exactly a year before his assassination. And this was that famous Beyond Vietnam speech. You know, it's all now digitized. You can find it on Google and Bing. It's just so amazing, the technology. So he says this about that war in Vietnam. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through, the poverty programs. And I knew that America, however, would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as the adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and now women, skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. Close quote. And then on the night before he died, the eve of his death, April 3rd, in Church in God Christ Church. A lot of people don't realize that. That's where he was. He was sick in a hotel. He's supposed to speak, but he was sick. And then Dr. Ralph Abernathy went to the host and says, Martin, they don't want to hear me. They want you. So he got up off of, sick bed and came to that church, Church of God in Christ. We got to lift that up because, the Black Baptists are going to claim everything. But I'm ecumenical, so. So even on his last public speech, April 3rd, 1968, the evening before he died, at that speech, this is what he proclaimed. It's all right to talk about long white robes over yonder in all its symbolism, but ultimately, people want some suits and some dresses and some shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey, but God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day. It's all right to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day God's preacher must talk about the New York, the new Atlanta, the new Philadelphia, the new Memphis, and he says the new Los Angeles. That's not Hopkins, that's King. This is what we have to do. So we can see in these major speeches of King, the 1955 speech in the beginning of the boycott in Montgomery, his speech, I Have a Dream speech in 1963, his 19 1967 speech Beyond Vietnam, and the fourth speech, the last one, which was given at Church of God of Christ Bishop Charles Mason Temple, April 3rd. There is a rich legacy and history of linking faith, wealth, and the Black church. He did this throughout his career. He mixed stories from the Bible with contemporary issues, and he challenged us to take on the Jesus story, the one who anointed us all. Let me just finish by saying, and I'll even uncharacteristic as a Baptist preacher or lecturer to leave some time. Usually I run over, but I got that clock ticking. I love it. I love this all organized. Because, Dr. Owens, we got our PhD together. 2 in the morning, we'd go to the small chapel at Union and be hooping and tuning.
That's right.
Thinking about what bishops we going to be. He became the bishop. I became the academic. But this is primarily the issue of faith, Black wealth, and the church is a theological issue.
That's right.
We talked about politics. We talked about economics. We've talked about globalization. We talked about church history, all those things. But to me, it's primarily a theological issue that's motivating this question, right? Theology is the interrelationship between theos and logos. Those Greek words, theos, God, logos is human reason or the human person. They say man in the classical text, but it's the human person. And what that is saying as a theologian and as theology, it says we need to interrogate the nature of our adherence to what the faith calls us to preach, to believe, to say, and do. Theology is an accountability discipline. It challenges the people of faith within the church to see if they are accountable to their vocation. That's what theology is. You got to know Koine Greek, because I ain't poo-pooing Koine Greek, but it fundamentally is a faith discipline. It is challenging the logos in relation to his or her relationship to the theos' calling. Are we being faithful to that which we have been called to believe, to say, to preach, and to do? And it's accountability. This is the thing about King. He said that I don't care if I lose my funding from rich liberals in New York and Los Angeles, who were really progressive brothers and sisters who funded a lot of the, they funded a lot of the stuff. We don't want to talk about it. I'm not going to, if I lose that, I lose that. If I lose my friendships with, the other big six civil rights organization, I lose that with NAACP and Brother Roy Wilkins and others, Foreman and Core. And if I lose even the lieutenants in the SCLC, his organization, he said, I'm going to be accountable to the faith. Yes. I'm going to be accountable to the faith. So obviously, he had the ultimate accountability, which is the ultimate witness, which in Koine Greek, martyrdom means, witness means martyrdom. Right. For all you, I know y'all know the Koine, see the students, we studied that last week. But that's why it's so important to end this discussion, this conversation on the clarity and the mission, the passion, the direction, and the motivation of the faith is a theological question. So that's why I enjoy theology, because you get to self-examine oneself by the light of the ultimate life, who is Jesus Christ. Thank you.
Hallelujah.